Thank you. The history of science is in some way the history of colloquial words becoming formal concepts. So what I want to do today is tell you the history of how knowledge is being transformed from a colloquial word to a formal concept. This is the history of the principles that govern the growth of knowledge, its diffusion, and also how we understand and we estimate its value. And these are important principles because for a long time, countries have tried to develop the knowledge of their economies. But sometimes they do it in ways that defy these principles and that usually do not work. So I want to start with one story, which is the story of Yachay. About 120 kilometers north of Quito, in what used to be until recently a plantation, you will find Yachay. Yachay means knowledge in Quechua. And Yachay was an attempt to build a city of knowledge and a university that were going to take the Ecuadorian economy into the 21st century. It was supposed to have everything. It was supposed to have biotech and robotics and artificial intelligence and a supercomputer. And it was supposed to combine the university with the city because the university was going to produce the graduates that then the city was going to employ in these high-tech industries. And the government really made a big effort. They put $1 billion into this project. That's 1% of the GDP of Ecuador. That's an enormous effort. But even though this effort was rather big in the beginning, the initial enthusiasm eventually waned. At the beginning, in 2014, people were ecstatic. Jose Andrade from Caltech said, "I'm personally in love with this idea. It is the greatest thing that I've seen in this country ever." Fernando Cornejo, a former Yachay academic manager, says, "There will be no more crowding. Each classroom will only have 15 students." And that was the problem. There was no crowding. So the reality of Yachay didn't live much to its expectations. It was really hard to build. You're trying to create a city of knowledge from scratch in a former plantation 2 hours north of Quito. You're bringing each brick and the mason that puts the brick on top of the others. So even until today, water is brought to Yachay in trucks because they don't have a proper water running system. There's a lot of half-finished buildings that might never be completed, where a lot of resources went into and that might never generate the knowledge that they were expected. Now, you might think that this is a particular case, but there are many cases like this in the world because it is not uncommon for people to confuse knowledge creation with architecture, that they try to create these science parks of these cities of knowledge in remote locations or far from the city centers, and eventually the vision doesn't pan out. And one of the reasons why this vision might not pan out is because knowledge also satisfies some principles. It's not something that you can create out of nothing or in anywhere, but there's some rules that govern how it grows, how it moves, and how we can estimate its value. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you about these principles. We first are going to look at the principles that govern how knowledge grows in time. Then we're going to look at how knowledge diffuses across space. Then we're going to understand how we can estimate its value. And then we're going to look at some implications of these principles going back to Yachay. So let's get started. The quantitative study of knowledge can be traced back to Leon Louis Thurston. Leon Louis Thurston started his life as an engineer, and he was a brilliant engineer. He went to work with Edison at some point. He almost, made it there, but he decided to go into academia instead, and he worked for a few years, in Minnesota, teaching engineering. But then he realized that what was difficult for him was not understanding the difficult math that is used in some engineering problems, but it was understanding why some students were better at learning than others. So he decided to go back to school. He first enrolled in the PhD in education at the University of Chicago, and then he moved into the PhD in psychology. And there he got his hands in some very interesting data, because in Pittsburgh in 1916, there was a class where students were learning how to type. And each week, those students had to take a test. And when the students would take a test, they would be able to, people like Thurston could estimate how well were those students learning. So what Thurston did is he grabbed the class data and he used it to map a learning curve. And you see there are no points all over the place. This is quite clean of a learning curve, in which what you see on the y-axis is how many words the students were able to type every 4 minutes. And on the x-axis, you don't see time. You see the amount of practice that the students have. And this is one of the first examples that we have of a learning curve, which has some very interesting characteristics. The first one is that you see that learning is really fast at the beginning, but then it slows down and it sort of saturates. The other one is that learning is not a function of time, but a function of experience or practice. Now, Thurston discovered this curve in the context of a typing class, but years later, the same effect was rediscovered. First by Theodore Paul Wright. He was one of the main American aircraft engineers, and Wright in 1936 wrote a paper in which he estimated the cost of manufacturing the last plane in a batch of planes, because planes tend to be manufactured in batches. And he also found that that cost fell according to a power law, similar to what Thurston had observed. Then in 1965, Leonard Rapping used data on the construction of Liberty ships. During the Second World War, the United States manufactured many ships, and they manufactured these ships in different shipyards, so he could use these large volumes of data to estimate the effects of learning. And again, he finds the power laws that Wright and Thurston had found before. But what happens is that in 1965, there's another chemical engineer that publishes a different learning curve. That's the learning curve of Gordon Moore. Moore doesn't find a curve in which learning is fast in the beginning and then peters out. He found evidence of learning being exponential. Yeah? The number of processors or integrated transistors that you could put in a wafer was doubling every 18 months to 2 years. And this was something that actually had been going on from way before Moore. Moore was able to observe it, Moore was able to document it, and the reason why this was accelerating at the time of Moore is because the price of transistors had been going down really fast. If you go back in time to like 1954, producing one single military-grade transistor would cost about $100 to $200. That's about $1,000 to $2,000 on today's money. Also, the capacity to produce transistors was quite limited. So at that rate, the transistors that are present in your iPhone 14 would have taken 12,000 years to produce and would have cost over $1 trillion. Okay? So the price of transistors is going down really, really fast, something that you cannot explain by the curves that were drawn by Thurston, Wright, or Rapping. At that learning speed, the students in Thurston typing class would have gone from 7 words a minute to about 1 million words a minute. So now we have a puzzle. How we can reconcile the learning curves that were documented by Thurston, Wright, and Rapping with the experience curve that was discovered by Moore. What is interesting is that the history of the transistor actually tells us about that story. So transistors were invented in the 1940s, in fact, as a response to an industrial need. Bell Labs was looking for a faster way to switch between telephone lines. They were using mechanical switches. They preferred the mechanical switches over vacuum tubes because they switch faster and they require less energy. But they wanted a more scalable solution. So in Bell Labs, there were people like William Shockley, Walter Brattain, and John Bardeen that were working on this problem and that eventually developed transistor technology. The thing is, when transistor technology came to be, it started to spread, and Shockley became worried that he was going to be left out of an industry that he had helped started. So in the early 1950s, he moves to California, he moves to Caltech, and he strikes a friendship with Arnold Beckman, who was a professor entrepreneur, who had developed one of the first ways to measure pH with an electronic device, and Beckman decides to invest in Shockley to develop a transistor company in the San Francisco Bay Area as a concession to Shockley because Shockley had grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So Shockley opens the semiconductor laboratory in 1955, sponsored by Beckman. In that process, he was looking for talent. He goes to the Cosmos Clubs in Washington, D.C., and he gives a flamboyant talk in which he actually throws transistors to the audience at the end of the presentation. And one of the people in the audience was Gordon Moore. Gordon Moore is very much impressed by this story, and eventually, receives a letter from Shockley, and he moves to California to work with him at, Shockley Semiconductor at Beckman Instruments. So they get started. They're trying to manufacture, transistors, but things are not moving very fast. And what happens in 1956 is that Shockley wins the Nobel Prize. So he has to go to Sweden. He's traveling around the world, and transistors are not being produced. So Beckman starts to get worried because he had advanced money for 2 years. They were nowhere close to producing a transistor. So he goes to California, to the Bay Area, to see what was happening. And he talks with Shockley, and Shockley gets extremely offended. And he tells him that, if he doesn't like the way that he's running the lab, he's going to leave, and everybody's going to leave with him. Everybody's looking at this discussion, and then they gather, during lunch, and they decide that, well, if Shockley leaves, it's not guaranteed that we're going to leave with him. So they contact Beckman, and they tell Beckman, that not necessarily they would leave with Shockley. So now Beckman becomes even more intrigued. He starts coming, to the Bay Area, more frequently, and there is a big falling out, that is explained in much more detail in my book, between these teams, so that the team that Moore and Noyce were part of decide to look for funding to start their own company. They contact through Arthur Rock, Sherman Fairchild, who used to be the main shareholder of IBM, and that allows them to start, Fairchild Semiconductor. Now, that was the right time, to break off, because in 1957, the Soviets had launched the Sputnik, and the Americans tried to catch up, and they tried to launch, a satellite which exploded and was nicknamed the Flopnik. So we have an accelerating race. Transistors are becoming increasingly important. The military really wants them. They're really trying to produce them. And what's happening behind the scenes is that the idea of the transistor is also changing. The transistors that were being produced at Fairchild were not the same transistors that were produced originally by Shockley. In 1957, they produced in 1956, they produced the Mesa transistor. Then eventually in 1959, they evolved to the planar design, and eventually in 58 and 59, they get to the idea of the integrated circuit. This idea was constantly evolving, so what it meant is that in reality, the growth of transistor technology was not a single learning curve, but was a collection of learning curves of different generations, of different ways of doing things that were building on each other, and the growth that you would observe across the industry was not the growth of a single team or of a single technology. It was not the growth that Thurston Wright and Rapping had described, but the one of multiple generations of individuals or multiple generations of technology. Each one of them was going even higher. Here in the UK, we can see the consumption of light. The consumption of light in the UK has increased enormously over the last few centuries, but it has not been the same technology. At the beginning, light came from candles, but candles also had an upper limit of how much light you were able to get out of them. Then moving to gas, then it moved to electricity, and electricity itself has changed the way in which we illuminate ourselves with electricity. The cost of light, of course, has been decreasing across all that time. If you had a modern light bulb, the amount of light services that that light bulb would provide if you would leave it on for an entire weekend, in 1,400, 1,300 prices, it would cost you 10,000 pounds. So it was an enormous change that also is an example of this relay between generations of technology. So those are some principles by which knowledge grows, and they look very hopeful. We see knowledge growing, and this is something that, of course, we want. But knowledge not always grows. We have to understand that sometimes knowledge also decays. There are also laws that govern forgetting. So let me give you a few examples of forgetting here. One of them is motivated by this very cute but interesting story that was published by The Guardian about a decade ago, in which people that had inherited lots of memorabilia from Elvis, they went into the market to try to sell it. And they realized that that memorabilia was falling in price. So what had happened is that there were people that were fans of Elvis. They had been buying memorabilia. That memorabilia had been appreciated throughout the decades. But now that these people were passing away, the buyers of memorabilia were also disappearing. So there were families that were inheriting these large amounts of memorabilia, they were going out to sell it, and the market was being flooded by other families that were in the same situation. This shows evidence that Elvis, that was once extremely popular, was not so popular anymore. The memory of him was fading. In fact, forgetting follows certain principles. When we look at the popularity of a song over time, compared to the year in which it was first famous, according to the Billboard rankings, you would see a curve in which memory decays fast in the beginning and slower at the end. At the beginning, memory is sustained by acts of communication, and then is sustained by cultural acts, by recorded acts of information. And this is true for songs, it's true for movies, it's true for paper citations and patent citations and so forth. But there's also loss of knowledge in industry. So using data on the Liberty ships, people have estimated how fast organizations or companies lose knowledge. The estimates say that an organization would lose knowledge at about 3% to 6% per month. You might think that 3%, 6% per month doesn't seem like a lot, but that's about 50% of all of your knowledge in a year, which allows us to answer one of the most important questions that Steve Carell has ever asked in his career. Is it true that if you don't use it, you lose it? And the answer is, when it comes to knowledge, yes, if you don't use it, you lose it. So the first law is the one that tells us about the growth of knowledge in time. When it comes to individuals, when it comes to teams, when it comes to firms, knowledge grows in more or less the patterns described by Thurston, Wright, and Rapping. It grows fast in the beginning, then eventually it peters out. But when we go to larger scales, we have a break, because now you can pass on the baton between different generations of a technology, and then you have growth that is exponential, and that continues over long periods of time. But we cannot expect that growth to be guaranteed. Knowledge is always being forgotten, and the reason why we observe knowledge growing is because we continue to practice these activities at a rate that offsets that of forgetting. So now let's move to the second set of principles, which look at the diffusion of knowledge, or how knowledge moves. And this is a story that illustrates very well those principles. This is the story of Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater was a man that was born at the right place and at the right time. He was born in the Midlands in the UK in the 1770s. And you might say, well, how come the Midlands were the right place at the right time back then? At that time, people were looking for technology that they could use to produce cotton yarn. Cotton yarn was actually a very important product. Today, we all use it. Jeans are made of cotton. But it was very hard to produce because hand-spun yarn was not strong enough to resist the pull of the looms. So to be able to produce proper cotton fabric, you needed very well-spun yarn. And there were patents in the 1730s that didn't lead to commercial ventures. And eventually, the development of cotton yarn came from the hands of men like Richard Arkwright and Jedediah Strutt. Arkwright was born north of Manchester, in Preston, not far from Blackburn, where James Hargreaves developed the spinning jenny. And then he develops the beginning of his system until he moves to Nottingham, who was an important center for the production of hosiery, because there he would find the demand for the yarn that he was trying to produce. He gets access to some finance. He tries to develop an operation in Nottingham that failed as well. And then he, through the bankers, gets connected to Jedediah Strutt, who was an entrepreneur and also an inventor. Strutt and Arkwright start working together, and eventually they produce the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in Cromford. Once they do that, the water-powered cotton spinning technology starts to diffuse across all of these nearby locations that had access to water power. And among one of them, Samuel Slater is born. Samuel Slater then joins one of these mills at the age of 14, and being very talented, he became an overseer. He became a manager of one of these mills. And when he's turning 20, 21, he started to realize a few things. The first one is that this technology was spreading, and if he was going to make it big in that industry, he got to go to a place where the technology was not yet available. The market was getting saturated. The technology was diffusing. The other thing was that the United States had publicized that they were trying to attract people that would be able to produce this technology. But the UK had said that this was an act of treason that was punishable. So therefore, you had to be very careful if you were going to do something like that. So what Slater does is he disappears one night without telling a soul, not even his family. He goes to London pretending to be a farmer, and he boards a ship to New York. And he arrives to New York on November of 1789. And when he arrives to New York, he goes into a mill that was in Manhattan. After 4 days, he realized that the machines there were no good. So he quits, and he learns from a sloop captain that there was a man in Pawtucket by the name of Moses Brown that was trying to produce a water-powered cotton spinning operation. So he writes to Moses Brown replies to him, and eventually he goes on New Year's to Pawtucket to talk to Moses in person. Moses tells him, like, look, if you can make these machines that we're building work, you can get a certain share of the profits, but someone later inspect the machines and say, like, these machines are no good, so there's no deal. What he was going to do instead is, please give me a skilled carpenter, a small salary for every day, and a room where we can conduct our business in secrecy. And within a year, Samuel Slater is able to build the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in the United States. And then there are other mills that start to sprout around that first mill, just like it had happened in the Midlands in the UK. So what Slater's story tells us is that knowledge doesn't travel just in acts of communication. The Americans knew that water-powered cotton spinning was possible, but the idea itself was not enough for the knowledge to travel. You needed someone with the experience that Samuel Slater had to make it work, someone that had worked for years in one of those mills. This is something that is extremely documented. If you want to look at economic geography and find something that it's very well known and something that people definitely agree on, is that the diffusion of knowledge is something that has a geographic constraint, but that geographic constraint is largely mediated by the movement of people and by their social networks. So this is something that Slater understood intuitively, and that now we have ample evidence in the scientific literature. But Slater also understood something else. He understood that he needed to migrate to a place where the knowledge that he had could take hold. He had knowledge, he had a seed, but he needed fertile soil to plant it. So an example of that idea is the story of Masaru Ibuka, one of the founders of Tetsuko, which later became Sony. And this is the idea of absorptive capacity, the idea that some places have the ability to capture knowledge because they're involved in research activities that allow them to absorb the knowledge that has been created by other researchers. So Ibuka was a very talented engineer. He had a magnificent career from a relatively young age. And he was working on radio technology during the Second World War, but after the war was over, he had to find a new way forward. He creates this company that is specialized in the beginning in relatively simple wares like rice cookers and so forth. But he learns that the Americans had brought a tape recorder. So he asks to see that tape recorder, and he looks at it with a lot of attention. He stands, he looks at the tape recorder, he counts, the revolutions and the time to calculate the speed at which the tape recorder was operating. And then he goes back to his team with the news, and they try to reproduce it. Now, what did they do to reproduce it? First, they start looking at the literature, and they realize that this has to be some sort of magnetic material. Eventually, they get the required chemicals from a black market in Tokyo, and they learn how to cook them using a frying pan so that this oxide would turn brown but not black, because they were able to remove it at the exact moment. Now that they had the magnetic material, they needed to figure out a way to put it on a tape. So, they figured out that maybe shellac, was the way to put it on tape, but they needed a tape that was strong enough to resist the pull, from the machine without deforming. They tried cellophane, that doesn't work, it would deform. They tried paper, it would snap, and eventually they find some hemp-reinforced paper that was strong enough to resist the pull from the machine. And now they need to have a way to deposit the shellac and the resin into the paper, and they discovered that there were these badger hair brushes that were fine enough to be able to deposit the magnetic material into the hemp-reinforced paper. So, to me, if figuring out how to produce magnetic tape with a badger hairbrush, a frying pan, and hem-reinforced paper is not an example of absorbing capacity, I don't know what is. Okay? So the second law is the law that tells us how knowledge moves in space. You know, knowledge moves in space as people move and also moves across social networks. It also requires a fertile ground to settle. It just doesn't simply move from one place to another, but it needs, you know, also a receptor to be able to take hold. But there's a problem with our description of the second law, which is that so far in this law and in the previous one, we have always been looking at knowledge as if it was the same thing, okay? We're looking at people that are typing, learning how to type faster and better, but it's knowledge about the same thing, knowledge on how to type. Or, you know, in the case of Samuel Slater, he moves the knowledge that he has on water-powered cotton spinning from the UK to the United States, but it's knowledge about the same thing. But in reality, knowledge is not just about one thing. We have knowledge about a lot of different things. Knowledge can be extremely nuanced. And the book is a lot about that. It's about the fact that knowledge, among many of the properties that it has, one that is key, that has not been emphasized enough, is the idea that knowledge is non-fungible, non-interchangeable, and extremely specific. This is something that you can understand by understanding that the idea of one knowledge plus one knowledge being two knowledges is a sentence that doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, knowledge is something that is, you know, difficult to characterize, but can be super specific. So let me tell you a story of how specific knowledge can get. So in 2012, I was in Chicago at the airport. I was waiting for a flight to Tokyo. And I go into the lounge, and it was about like 11 a.m. in the morning. And there's a man with blonde hair, you know, hair burned from seawater and salt, you know, with summer clothes. This is Chicago in February, okay? So it's the middle of the winter. Clearly, he was not from there. And we started talking, and he asked me what I did for a living. I tell him what I did for a living. And when I ask him, well, what do you do for a living? He tells me that he's a lawyer, and then he changes the subject. So he didn't want to talk about it. Okay, so we keep on talking, and we talk about different things, and eventually, about like half an hour later, he said, you know what? I like you. I'm going to tell you my story. So he said, in the 1980s, I was a lawyer in Florida, and I was working at a law firm, and I got fired. And I was in my apartment. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. You know, I didn't know what was going to be of me. And I get a phone call one day from a friend that tells me, hey, Charlie, I cannot show up to court tomorrow. Can you please postpone my case? Can you, please, reschedule it? And this is something that he could do because in Florida, any lawyer can extend a case, not only the lawyers that are working on that particular case. So Charlie, who's a quick thinker, says, $50. Okay. So word starts to spread that Charlie would extend your court case for $50. So he starts getting calls. It's like, hey, Charlie, I'm shit-faced. I'm drinking too much. I cannot go tomorrow. Can you extend the case? Okay, $50, And if you get the reference from the T-shirt, you'll understand that Better Call Charlie, which is a court coverage service firm, became successful in this very specific niche of knowledge. Now, Charlie, I'm a friend in Facebook with him. I see him at Burning Man. I see him, skydiving, and he enjoys a beautiful life in which he travels around the world, where this little machine in Florida keeps on doing this court coverage services work while, he keeps on enjoying his life. But this tells you that knowledge can be extremely specific. You are specialized in court coverage services in the state of Florida, and this is something that they learn to do so well that it's good for the other firms to hire him because they know the extension process better. They know the court where they're going to make that extension better than the lawyers that are dealing with the case. But probably Charlie would not be maybe a good maritime law lawyer or would not be a very good criminal lawyer. Because knowledge can be extremely specific. It is non-fungible. It's not one thing. It's a lot of little things. And that's why I call it the infinite alphabet. Okay? So if we're going to understand knowledge, at some point, we have to go beyond the descriptions in which we're looking at learning about the same thing. We have to look at learning across different things. And we have to understand how the specificity of each piece of knowledge affects that learning or that knowledge diffusion process. So we can think of knowledge moves between nearby locations. This is the story of Samuel Slater, or any story about knowledge moving across a social network, but also can move between related activities. And when knowledge moves among related activities, we have to take care about the specificity. Because if it's going to move from one activity to another, the activity from where knowledge starts and the activity where knowledge ends are going to be specific, are not going to be any activity. So a story that we can use to understand this idea is the story of the Vespa. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Vespa. It's a beautiful scooter, very iconic, beautifully designed as well. But the person that designed the Vespa, he was not crazy about motorcycles. He was actually an aircraft engineer. His name was Corradino d'Ascanio. He designed multiple helicopters. He was sort of like the equivalent of Theodore Wright, but for Italy during the Second World War. And the problem was that even though he was very successful as a helicopter designer, and he was working in the Piaggio factory, which was an aircraft design factory in Italy, when the war was over, they couldn't move forward with those activities because Italy was no longer allowed to manufacture aircraft, because aircraft factories had been military targets, they had been bombed and destroyed, and the streets of Italy had also been destroyed, bridges had been bombed, and so forth, so people struggled to move around. So they needed to pivot. And what they decided to pivot to was to the creation of a scooter, that was quite particular. The mudguard was the body, so it was a scooter in which you could go to work, even on dirty streets, and still arrive clean. It had the engine on the back, which made it much more inclusive because it's easier to sit on a scooter that has the engine on the back. And also, it had a wheel that could be detached easily in case, the tire went flat, just like it was detached in the helicopters. Now you might say, this is an anecdote. Maybe, this is just one example of an aircraft engineer becoming a scooter designer. But the thing is, there were many countries involved in the Second World War. So if we go to Japan, for instance, we have Aichi. Aichi also manufactured aircraft. They manufactured different types of aircraft. And when the war was over, they had a similar story than that of the Piaggios. They could no longer manufacture aircraft, and they needed to find a new way forward. So guess what Aichi did at the end of the Second World War? Well, they went into the light vehicle manufacturing with brands like Giant and Koni. Then we have Kawanishi. Kawanishi also manufactured transport planes, manufactured fighter planes, and after the war was over, they also needed a new way forward. They needed to redeploy the knowledge that they had on how to manufacture aircraft into something that they could sell. What did they do? They did the super lassie motorcycle. They also went into light vehicle manufacturing. And in Germany, we have similar stories. We have Heinkel. Heinkel was the first company to fly a jet propulsion plane. That's an important feat. But after the war was over, also they were no longer able to continue in the aircraft industry. So what did they do? They did the ugly version of the Vespa, the Heinkel Tourist. So what these examples tell you is when push comes to shove and you push someone away from an industry and they need to find a new way forward, they don't go into any other industry because the knowledge that they have is non-fungible, is rather specific, and they have to go into activities that can reuse in the best way possible the knowledge that they already have. So knowledge itself also has a geography. It's not just the geography of countries, but the geography of knowledge itself. And that's the geography of the product space. In this network, each node is a product, and products are connected if they're likely to be co-exported. And you can build networks like this using different types of data. You can connect products that are co-exported, industries that co-locate, industries that share workers or that share worker categories, technologies that tend to appear in the same patents, research fields in which the same scientists tend to publish, and so forth. And no matter which one of these ones you choose, you are going to be able to produce a network that's going to give you a geography of that knowledge. And when you look at the geography of that knowledge and you see how all of these different entities move over time, the products that a country starts exporting in the future, or the research activities that a scientist is going to perform in the future, what you're going to find is a principle that is satisfied in all of them, which is that the probability that you would enter an activity increases with the number of related activities that are present, and the probability that you would exit that activity decreases with the presence of other related activities. Meaning that the diffusion of knowledge is constrained by the geography of knowledge. And this is what we call the principle of relatedness. And this is the second part of the second law, of this law of diffusion. Diffusion is not just about movement of knowledge in space or in physical space, geographic space, cultural space, social space, but also in the space of ideas, in the space of knowledge, because knowledge in itself has a geography. And for that second part, we need to care about the infinite alphabet. We need a representation that is specific about each one of these activities. Now, let's go into the third principle. The third principle is the one that is scientifically a little bit more complicated, and honestly, we need an entire lecture just to explain how we calculate things, but I'm still going to try to do it using a story. The third law is about how we estimate the value of knowledge. And here you can think of knowledge as an infinite alphabet in which different locations have different letters of the alphabet, and they can therefore produce different words, which are combinations of these letters. So the third law is about how many letters you have and how valuable these letters are. But the problem is that we don't know what these letters are. We know that knowledge is non-fungible, it's not interchangeable in specific, but do we know how to really chunk it? We don't know. But maybe we can estimate it if we know the activities that are present in a location. So the story that I'm going to share with you is a story in which we're going to compare two people that had a very similar early life, but eventually they diverge in the things that they were able to accomplish later in life. And this is the story of Walt Disney and René Rios or Pepo. You probably heard of Walt Disney. He was born in Chicago. He was raised in Missouri. Then he went to the Chicago Art Institute, and he became a newspaper cartoonist. Then he started an animation company with UV Iwerks. That company did not work, had to dissolve. He went a little bit into advertising. Then he started another company with UV Iwerks. That company produced Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. That was stolen by Universal. So then in response to that, they created Mickey Mouse in 1928. And then, they became unstoppable. They were producing originally, newspaper cartoons. That's where, Disney started. Then they produced animation. Then they produced the first animated feature, in history, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Then they produced, theme parks. And by the end of his life, he was going into real estate, and urban development, because Epcot Center was not originally designed as a theme park, was the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, was a laboratory to experiment new ways of building cities. Now, René Rios was also extremely talented. He was born in Concepcion, Chile, and he made, exhibits at the age of 10. He was smart enough to get admitted into medical school, and he quits medical school because his passion was really in the arts. So eventually he becomes a newspaper cartoonist. And after meeting Walt Disney in the late 1940s, he comes up with Condorito, which is the best-known Chilean cartoon. And Condorito becomes a very successful magazine on its own, but it's never able to jump into the next step. The first movie about Condorito is actually in 2017, and it was just barely breaking even. So both Disney and Pepo were talented. They both moved into bigger cities looking for opportunities. In the case of Disney, he eventually moves to Los Angeles. In the case of Pepo, he moved to Santiago. But they have different fates. And you might say, well, because Los Angeles is quite different from Santiago. And that is exactly the point. In the case of Disney, when he gets to Los Angeles, he has way more letters to play around and to combine than the ones that Pepo had available in Santiago. There were talented voice artists, and there were talented animators, and there were talented people, that knew how to set up the cameras and take the photography for the animation. And there were, a number of people that René Rios did not have available. There were more pieces in Los Angeles alphabet. So what we can do is mathematically we'll actually factor, these alphabets out of matrices that tells us which activities are present in which economies. And when we do this, we get very interesting maps. We get maps that are quite different from that of population and that can help us explain economic growth, inequality, and emissions. Here are a few maps like that. The first one on the top left is a map of the world in which we look at economic complexity using trade data. And of course, Europe, the United States do quite well, but for example, China, which is not a country that is at that level of GDP per capita, is also doing quite well too. India, which is quite poor by global standards, is doing quite well as well. On the right, you have maps of the United States, in which we estimate economic complexity using data on industry payroll or patents. And we also see some interesting patterns. For example, when we look at the patent data, Austin does much better than Chicago, even though Chicago is a much bigger city because Austin is a center of innovation. So what has happened is that this measure of knowledge has become so popular that it's used in policy. It's in Malaysia, the first mission of its new industrial master plan. In the EU, was used in the Draghi report, when the Draghi report was trying to compare the economy of Europe with that of the US and China in key technologies. What did they use, to compare if they were in the frontier or not? Well, measures of relatedness and complexity. In the UK, the Government Office for Science has been experimenting with the use of these measures to try to develop a UK science policy. In Kazakhstan, has been mentioned extensively in presidential speeches and is part of the 2029 National Development Plan and was part of the previous 2025 Development Plan. So the third law, the law of value, tells us that if we want to count the pieces of the infinite alphabet, we have to look at the activities that locations are specialized in. We have to factor those pieces out. And if we're able to do that properly, we're going to have a measure of potential that can help us understand how fast economies can grow. So what are some of the implications of these principles? So let me go through a few examples that can help us understand the world now using the laws that govern the growth, diffusion, and value of knowledge. One of the questions that you might have is, well, when you look at the connection between Thurston's principles and those of Moore, why incumbents failed to compete with the new entrants? We had a lot of stories of incumbents losing to new entrants. Like Kodak was not great at digital photography, okay? Or, we have examples, in many industries in which the ones that come after are able to take over the ones that are established, even though the ones that are established have enormous amount of resources and they have access to the market. So one of the reasons that explain this is that sometimes there are changes in innovation that look small but are actually dramatic. And that's what we call architectural innovation. This was a concept that was introduced by Rebecca Henderson. The example that, for example, she uses in one of her papers is that when jet engines came along, all of the companies that were specialized on propeller aircraft, they struggled because when you had a propeller aircraft, you could change an engine for another. But when you had to change from a propeller engine to a jet engine, you had to redesign the entire airframe. So you had to design the entire plane. Then that was an architectural innovation. You had to rethink how all of the pieces were connected. You might remember that in the 1990s and early 2000s in the United States, there were these beautiful bookstores like Borders and Barnes and Nobles. I'm sure that here in the UK, you also had like these amazing bookstores as well. And you might think that the idea of sending a book directly to a customer, it's not something that is going to change an industry dramatically. Might look like a small change. But in reality, that's an example of an architectural change, because the difference between shipping directly to a consumer or selling an item in a store is so large that if this is how a Barnes & Nobles used to look like, this is how an Amazon fulfillment center looks like. Okay? You cannot simply transform the first one into the second one. This small change is not small, it's architectural, means rethinking the entire way that the organization works. The same thing happens with Blockbuster and Netflix. Blockbuster had the chance to buy Netflix. I tell the story in the book. They had the option to buy Netflix for $50 million in the year 2000. And they said no, because they thought, of course, if we have all of these stores and we're able to serve all of these customers with all of these DVDs, building a website and sending DVDs to some customers is not something that is that difficult. But again, they underestimated the architectural innovation that shipping directly to consumer was. Because this is how a Blockbuster store used to look like, and this is how a Netflix fulfillment center looked like. They're very different types of operation. Now, the other story that I want to tell you is I want to tell you some stories of some successes, because at the time that Yachay was being developed, China was also going through some innovation policy changes, and some of them target Zhongguancun. Zhongguancun is a neighborhood in Beijing, which is located in the northwest side of the city, in one of these ring roads. And unlike Yachay, who is in a very remote location, it's located close to Tsinghua University, Peking University, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Beijing Institute of Technology, the Physics Institute, and so forth. And it had a very successful history of innovation. It started with the story of Chen Xunxiang, which I'm going to skip here, but it's an amazing story that I would recommend you look at in the book. It also the place where Lenovo got started, which is another amazing story. But I'm going to focus on the 2010s because that's the same time in which Yachay was being developed. And at that time, Kai-Fu Lee and Wo Hong met, and they decided to help develop Zhongguancun in a plan in which, instead of trying to create a science park or a technology park 2 hours north of Beijing in a remote location with lots of space, they focused on a street segment, on what they call the Avenue of the Entrepreneurs. And they say, we're going to pack this as densely as we can with entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and so forth. And what we're going to do is we're going to develop these funds that they call the guiding funds. And in a guiding fund, what you had is that the government would a certain amount of money, invited the private sector to put a certain other amount of money, and if the fund was successful, the privates had the option to buy the shares of the public sector at a prefixed price. So what that did is that it generated an incentive to invest because the privates now would be able to buy out the shares of the government if the fund was successful at a prefixed price, so they had an even better asymmetric upside. And that policy was successful. It elevated, the venture capital in China by orders of magnitude in a few years and was reproduced around the country, again, not in remote science parks, but targeting city centers in different parts of China. Also, another thing that they did that was very smart is that they target short cycle technologies. So if we go back to the Thurston-Moore story, you can think that these overlapping curves could have a different distance between them. You can have technologies that have long cycles, that from one generation to the next, you have to maybe wait 10, 15, 20 years. Like biotech is a very long cycle technology. It takes a long time to develop and commercialize a viable drug. But there are technologies that are short cycles, that they're changing constantly. Like, for example, smartphone applications. And in those technologies that are short cycle, you have many windows of opportunity because every time these learning curves overlap, you have an opportunity for disruptive innovation. So they targeted the short cycle technologies. So now let's go back to Yachay. How would we do Yachay if we were to do it again? What would we do differently? Let's say that we have $1 billion in Ecuador to try to develop, their knowledge economy. So the way that Yachay worked originally, and this is a caricature, I'm not saying that this is exactly how this was done, but it was, you had $1 billion, you put a certain fraction of it into the construction of infrastructure, you put another fraction of it in hiring personnel, research personnel, staff, and so forth, but you are spending all of that money, so after a period of time, let's say 5, 6, 7 years, you run out of money, and what you have is a bunch of buildings that might be half finished, and a lot of people that are expecting a paycheck by the end of next month. So how would you do this differently? Well, one thing that we need to understand is what is the price of a researcher? What is the international price of a researcher? So the international market for researchers, you can get an idea of the prices by looking at the different awards that are coveted by researchers around the world. So in Europe, the best grant that you can get is an ERC advanced grant that gives about 2.5 million in a period of 5 years, so it's like 500,000 euros a year. Being a Max Planck Institute director is a really good deal. It's 1 to 2 million years on research budget support. Being an ETH chair in Switzerland, it's also about 1 million Swiss francs a year. In the US, an RO1 grant is similar to an ERC. So what you should take out of this slide is that in academia, $1 million a year goes a long way for a research lab. So if we were to grab, the $1 billion of Yachay, how could we invest them differently? So imagine we build an endowment in which we have a 4% payout rule. So that billion is paying 40 million a year. Now those 40 million get distributed into 40 chairs that have 1 million a year each. Not for 10 years, not for 20 years, but for infinity years because it's an endowment, so it continues to pay. This is quite conservative. The S&P 500 tripled in the time that Yachay was being developed. Now, you can use these chairs to go and attract, top-tier talent to move to Ecuador and to move not into a remote location, but into the universities and the places that might exist there, or even in some cases, if you have labs that do not require any specialized facilities, to rent office space to conduct, for example, computational work. And you might say, well, but maybe in Ecuador, there's not too much, there are not too many places where you can move. But the thing is, there is another story in Ecuador that is different than that of Yachay, and that was the development of a university that was actually quite successful. This is the story of San Francisco de Quito University. So in the 1970s, Santiago Gangotena was an Ecuadorian physicist that was studying nuclear physics in North Carolina. And he had a dream. He had a dream to go back to Ecuador, not to build a nuclear power plant, but to build a university like the one that he was experiencing in the United States. So he gets back to Ecuador in 1977, 1978, and he creates the CPU Foundation, the Corporación de Promoción Universitaria, but it's a pun on the word CPU, in 1980, and the goal was to create the first private university in Ecuador. Now in Ecuador, private universities were not allowed at that time, so he had to ask Congress for approval. So they prepared all of the papers that they needed to get approval from Congress, and they go to Congress, they have a hearing, and what do you think Congress said when they present all of those papers? Did they allow them to to do the university? No. So then, in 1981, they prepared all of the papers, they can apply only once a year, they try again, and what did Congress say? No, thank you. Then in 1982, they try again. And what did they say? They say no. 1983, they try again. And they say no. 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, they go, and Congress says no again. But this time, Gangotena says, you know what? We're going to do it anyway. So he gets everyone together and says, we're going to do it anyway. And they go to the newspapers, and they start advertising this new university, and it starts to generate buzz. And people come to the open house, and there's a lot of excitement. But then people started to learn that this university did not have any licensing or accreditation, and they get kind of scared of enrolling their kids at that university. There was a convent that has promised the classroom space, and the Congress says, you know what, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole, this is getting complicated. So they pull out 2 weeks before the semester starts. So what do? Well, they rent a house, that house that you see there on that picture in Ecuador, and they set up the physics lab in the kitchen, and they set up a cafeteria in the basement, and they start slowly building this university without any accreditation, just with the strength and with the power of each one of these faculties. And today, the University of San Francisco de Quito is by many accounts the most successful university in Ecuador. That it shows that actually if you do things maybe differently, not through like a giant push in the middle of nowhere, but organically, with teams that are highly committed, you can get to that goal. So there are places in Ecuador where people could have been attracted, where that $1 billion could have been put to better use. One of the biggest disappointments of growing up is learning that the universe is finite. I don't know, for me that was hard to accept as a physicist, the idea that the universe is finite, that there might be, a size under which this is all constrained. And there are many numbers that we have for that infinity by now, that finiteness. We can talk about time. We can say that the universe is about 13 billion years old. We can talk about size. We can say that it's 10 to the 26 meters in diameter. We can talk about particles. We can say that the universe has 10 to the 80 particles, and those are big numbers. There are lots of zeros, but they're still finite. That's still not satisfying. They're still finite, and that is really tough. But maybe we have to think about it a little bit differently. So imagine an alphabet with 100 unique characters and a blank piece of paper where you can write 1,000 characters. How many possible combinations can you write? Well, that's 100 to the 1,000 or 10 to the 2,000. Okay? So just with 100 characters and a page in which you can write 1,000 of them, the total possible number of combinations that you have is way more than the total number of particles in the universe. Enormously more. And in a deep sense, knowledge lives in this second universe. This larger universe made of options and possibilities. A universe where we can write an infinite number of songs with a finite number of notes, a universe that hides an infinite number of stories in a few pages. Thirstone typing class students can make us think of knowledge as something finite, but infinity is not about trivial things, such as the student's typing speed, but about the complexity of new combinations that are made possible by people, because we are the ones who carry knowledge. Each of us carry only a few letters, but together we get to move those letters around and discover new letters and combinations. It is through the virtue of our lives that our feeble minds and weak bodies give rise to something larger than our minds, something beyond our comprehension, the most valuable treasure of our species, knowledge's ever-growing and almost infinite alphabet. Thank you.